All right, welcome back to class. This is American Federal Government. I'm Ken Hicks, and up until this point in the semester, everything we've been doing is kind of leading up to the last several presentations where we actually look at what government is actually doing. And so our first presentation is going to be on domestic policy. We're going to do two presentations on domestic policy and then two presentations on foreign policy. That will pretty much exhaust the subject matter of the course. So domestic policy reflects what is captured in the preamble, the idea that the purpose of government is to promote the general welfare and ensure domestic tranquility. So what are we going to learn today? Government shapes economic policy with three tools. A lot of Americans don't fully understand the relationship between government and the economy. Some people think that they really don't have a relationship, but they always have, and they likely always will. Second, we're going to talk about the political implications of economic policy. It always tends to be contentious because people, again, have fundamentally opposed views on the role of government in the economy. And then we're going to talk about the welfare state, which emerged in many places in the late 19th century, didn't really emerge in the United States until about the third decade of the 20th century. And the welfare state is designed to attempt to ameliorate the worst consequences of market interactions, market dislocations. So the government shapes economic policy with three basic tools. And I want to make one point really clear, first and foremost, and that is that government really establishes the economy, okay? Government tells us, what money is worth. Government helps to create and to protect markets. These are really primordial aspects of any economic action. There may be economies that exist outside of government, but government nevertheless plays a structuring role in establishing an economy. So historically, American kind of social policy has pursued three main goals, and that is alleviating risks that people might face in their everyday lives, either through illness, disability, loss of income, due to aging or unemployment. Second, we want to expand economic opportunities through various programs. We want you to have access to education, for example. So the government provides access to student aid. And third, we want to alleviate poverty, which is the most consistently controversial domestic policy. Conservatives often attribute poverty to bad decision making, while liberals would basically say that quite frequently, poverty is simply a result of conditions that people may not have any control over. And liberals historically have argued that the more people we lift out of poverty, the more taxpayers there are, the more that tax burden can be lifted off of those people who are in the middle and upper classes. So the government shapes economic policy with three basic tools. Now, first of all, the United States Constitution empowers the federal government to take actions to establish, maintain, and protect markets. Both the preamble, which again includes language, empowering the government to make such interventions as would form a more perfect union, with an emphasis on securing the blessings of liberty. That is, again, kind of a pay-on to the idea of personal autonomy, that is sort of an ultimate aim for most Americans. There is also an intergenerational component, the idea that we're doing these things for ourselves and our posterity, and posterity means sort of future generations. Likewise, Article 1, Section 8 expressly delegates to Congress the authority to make laws and collect taxes, to lay and collect taxes, to pay the debts, and to provide for the common defense and general welfare, to borrow money, to coin money, and to regulate its value. Okay, all of these things suggest that the government has these authorities. The Constitution, however, is silent on how those powers can be used. And of course, as our nation has evolved, the tools that have been made, that have become available to government have dramatically increased. With again, in 1787, we're a very small nation. Probably had fewer than 4 million people living in the 13 former colonies. Which was again a very large territory when you compare it to Europe. Those 13 original colonies is roughly the size of Western Europe. So it was a large territory, and people didn't live technologically advanced lives. People were, for the most part, living on farms. And so the needs coming from the needs that citizens would make, the demands that they would make on government were relatively light at that time. As more and more people have begun living in cities, the need for government has dramatically increased over time. So this is an evolving process. The tools have changed as the economy has become more complex. There is, again, a lot of debate over which tools to employ. You're going to see a dramatic difference between how the Biden administration used economic policy to try and improve infrastructure and improve different recycling or renewable energy technologies and things like that, versus what the Trump administration is going to do over the next several years, beginning in January of 2025. So these debates don't simply reflect technical concerns, which tool to use at which particular point in time, whether in a recession it's better to rely strictly on monetary policy or to focus on taxing and spending. These kinds of differences also reflect deep ideological conflicts within an overarching liberal framework. Because again, most Americans are liberals. They believe in individual freedom. That's really what liberalism at its base means. So one of the main tools that we have is the idea of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy consists of the government's use of taxing and spending powers to manipulate the economy. Fiscal policy is generally employed in an attempt to smooth out what had previously been described as the boom and bust nature of the business cycle. In economics, boom and bust refers to the tendency for economic growth to occur in fits and starts, with rapid growth often contributing to inflation. Now, inflation is a bad thing. Inflation can simply be defined as the idea of too much money chasing too few goods. That leads to the value of money decreasing. Okay, so as inflation spreads, people stop spending. And that leads to unemployment, which can also cause a contraction in the economy. If the economy is getting smaller, that means fewer people are working. That means more hardship. And so government exists typically to try and smooth out those kinds of cycles. So the goal of economic is to produce, it's the Goldilocks thing, right? You don't want the economy running too hot, and you certainly don't want it not running at all. You don't want it contracting. With an advanced, large, economy like ours, 2% growth is really kind of what you're looking for. Anything more, and you might begin seeing inflationary pressures coming into the economy. So as an example, what causes inflation? An economist's description, again, would be inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. The causes of inflation are complex, but they may include bad investments that create what is known as a bubble, where a certain asset within some sector of the economy is overvalued, and people pump money into that one area, and that area ends up being overvalued. And at some point, again, what has to happen is that there has to be a correction. Okay, and so a lot of people argue and this was a common argument during the 2024 presidential campaign, that the Biden administration was responsible for inflation because of all the COVID-related spending. And there is an ongoing debate among economists as to whether federal programs to combat COVID-19 caused inflation. Some economists have argued that the size of the programs had relatively little effect, that in fact inflation was a result of supply chain snarls that again, for example, with gasoline. during COVID, for much of COVID, almost a 2-year period, there was a dramatic decrease in the number of people who were driving. That led to a sharp decline in the demand for gasoline. So when COVID, when we got vaccines and people started feeling comfortable going out again, driving suddenly escalated, and that meant that suppliers had to restart their supply lines for petroleum. Other economists argue that the U.S. economy performed better than many other countries with advanced economies that didn't do as much, to combat inflation. Still, other economists have argued that inflation might have been reduced had the Biden administration reduced federal spending after 2022. Had the Biden administration slowed down the rate of spending, that might have reduced the kinds of inflationary pressures that people were experiencing. It's an open debate because, again, we haven't really reached, we don't have enough evidence yet to really say decisively one way or the other, what was going on. Taxation for most of the 19th century, the federal government wasn't doing that much, and consequently, they didn't need a lot of money. Okay, for much of the 19th and into the early 20th century, the primary source of revenue for the federal government came in the form of tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods. So between 1816 and 1845, the U.S. government relied heavily on the taxation of imported goods, and tariffs constituted the majority of revenues. And the U.S. Tariffs on foreign goods were among the highest in the world because it was popular. There's this old saying, "Don't tax him, don't tax me, tax that feller behind the tree." And tariffs are an example of transferring the costs of government onto other people, onto people who are not citizens, who are not otherwise taxpayers. And that's very popular. But again, what does it do? It also causes other governments to impose tariffs on the goods that the United States is exporting to those countries. And oftentimes, when you rely on tariffs, those costs are passed along to American consumers. And again, that's one of the reasons why we often describe tariffs as protectionist. You are using tariffs as a way of shielding domestic industries from foreign competition. So along with excise taxes, which are taxes on specific goods like alcohol, tobacco, gasoline, most of the federal revenues were taken up with tariffs and excise taxes. Okay? Until well into the 20th century, much of the government's revenues came from high tariffs and excise taxes, and most Americans associated high tariffs with higher wages for working class Americans. And so most Americans were strongly supportive of tariffs well into the 20th century. The Progressive Era saw the emergence of a new source of funding for the federal government, and that is the income tax. In 1913, Congress, there was an amendment process that resulted in the ratification of the 16th Amendment. Now, income taxes are the most efficient way for a government to grab revenue, okay, to get access to revenue. That is one of the reasons why many conservatives are deeply hostile to the idea of income taxes. You see many people on the right basically advocating the repeal of the 16th Amendment and the elimination of income taxes, one of the consistent themes of the Republican Party. In fact, one of the few things that they're actually able to achieve when they have unified control of government is cutting taxes. They have routinely cut taxes on high-income earners. They have routinely cut taxes on corporations. Okay. Likewise, again, the creation of the Social Security system in 1935 provided a significantly expanded source of federal revenue. We'll talk more about Social Security in a little bit. But in simple terms, Social Security was sold to the American people in the 1930s as a social insurance plan, as a conservative way to ensure that you would have savings in old age. And so it is a dedicated savings plan. It is set up so that you pay in every month, every time you earn money, every time a paycheck is issued to you, a certain amount of money goes to FICA, which is the Social Security dedicated fund. And your employer also matches that contribution. And so, ultimately, and here's kind of the dirty little secret about Social Security, all that money goes in, ultimately ends up in the general revenues, okay? Because what happens is the Social Security system then purchases U.S. bonds. And the money that is used, to purchase those bonds then goes into the general revenue fund. But in the meantime, eventually the Social Security Trust Fund has to cash out those bonds to make their payments to Social Security recipients. And so when people argue that Social Security is in a tenuous place, well, first and foremost, but they're holding trillions of dollars of bonds. And it would basically be the destruction of the U.S. economy for anyone to renege on a debt that large. So the idea of progressivity or regressivity in taxation is an important issue. The largest share of federal revenue today comes in the form of individual income taxes. And keep in mind, the federal government these days, the typical annual budget is in excess of $6 trillion. Now, that sounds like a lot of money. That's a ton of zeros, right? You're writing a lot of zeros when you write $6 trillion. But it's also important to keep in mind that the United States is routinely producing around $26 to $27 trillion in gross domestic or gross national product. So it's a lot of money, but yes, this is a continent-sized country with 340 million people, and so there's a lot of stuff going on. Taxes can be progressive or regressive depending on which demographic groups the taxation falls most heavily on. A progressive tax is one that hits upper income tax brackets, upper income earners most heavily. So an example would be the income tax. America's federal income tax scheme is progressive in nature. And that is based on a fundamental economic principle of ability to pay. Wealthy people can afford to pay a larger proportion of their income in taxes. In contrast, a tax is regressive if it hits lower income brackets most heavily. And an example of that, for example, is tax on groceries. Again, part of the problem is that poor people have to basically spend just about all their income on just meeting their basic needs on a paycheck to paycheck basis. And when you talk about people living paycheck to paycheck, what that means is they have very little discretionary income, and therefore they have very little capacity, very little ability to save, to set aside money. So more and more of their money is deployed on basic things like groceries. And so, that typically means that the more you're charging in grocery taxes, the heavier that burden is going to fall on lower income people. So tax regimes at the state and local level are oftentimes far more regressive. Okay, so again, that is the challenge that you confront when you're looking at how you're going to set up. Again, how you fund your government. And for many people, it's not an argument, they just don't want to fund government. They don't like government. But anarchism is not a system that works. If it did, it would have been tried and would have succeeded. It never has, and frankly, I don't believe it ever will. So if you look at this slide, this really offers you an interesting comparison, and it shows you how the progressivity of American taxation has declined over time. In 1966, 42% of income from the federal revenues that went into funding the federal government came from income taxes. 23% came from corporate taxes. 20% were dedicated to social insurance and retirement programs, and 10% were excise taxes. If you look today, nearly half of all revenues today are coming in the form of income taxes. Corporate taxation has declined to 7%, and it's going to decline further because the Trump administration is going to come in and is going to cut corporate taxes even further. 35% of all receipts now are coming in the form of social insurance, of Social Security and Medicare. And again, that is money that's going to have to be paid out to recipients, especially as we age. We are getting older. You know, the cohort that's going into retirement age is older than the people who are the millennials and the people who are now currently entering the workforce. And that is a real demographic challenge that we're going to have to work through, and we're going to have to figure out important, we're going to make some tough choices. And some of those tough choices are going to involve people not getting as much in the way of goods and services, or we're going to have to pay higher taxes down the line. We've been kicking this can down the road for almost 30 years now. So again, government collects revenue from a variety of different sources, and how you configure that. If you actually go back another 10 years to the 1950s, the corporate income tax was almost a third of all federal revenues, and the other programs were much smaller, and the amount of money that was coming from income taxes was again smaller still. So that tells you again that in the early part of the 20th century, we were much more aggressively progressive in terms of how we taxed things. So when you look at this slide, this is America, this is kind of America side by side. Tax rates can be difficult to compare across countries. So some countries set very different income tax rates for married people and those with children. Oftentimes countries like Japan and Germany, they're trying to incentivize people having children because, again, they recognize they have a cohort problem. They are aging out. Lots and lots of younger Japanese and Germans are declining to have children, and that means their population is beginning to shrink. And in simple economic terms, if your economy is shrinking, you are declining as a country. You're not able to provide the kinds of goods and services that your country has grown accustomed to. And so there are a couple of things that you can do to try and prevent that. And one thing is to incentivize your citizens to have children, to start families. Another thing you can do is encourage immigration. Now we are also having an issue with Americans having fewer children. One of the reasons why our economy, however, performed better than other European countries is that we had a great equalizer in that we had lots and lots of immigration coming into the country. Oftentimes in the form of undocumented immigrants. Whatever you think about these folks, they were working in the agricultural sector, they were working in the construction sector. And so, they were working in restaurants, and they were picking vegetables, and again, if you want a new roof here in Oklahoma, you better get it done pretty quick, because when they start rounding up undocumented immigrants, a lot of roofing companies are going to find themselves strapped for labor, and you're going to find that you're going to be on a waiting list to get a new roof. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind. Again, when you look at this slide, it shows you again how different countries tax people, with one earner, married couple with 2 children. The tax rates in Australia are the same because, again, they've gotten a lot of immigration. They don't really have that kind of problem. But if you look at Germany, for a single person, no child, the tax rate is 40%. But one earner, married couple with 2 children, it's 22%. So that's an enormous tax benefit. Okay. Likewise, if you look, for example, where at Japan, it's the same. Part of the reason for that, too, though, is Japan, again, they don't have a lot of income disparity, right? The lowest, the percentage of Japanese that earn less than $50,000 a year is only about 1%. But the percentage of Japanese that earn in excess of $500,000 a year is only, again, about 1%. So they don't have the kinds of income inequality that the United States has. And that has to do a lot with culture. because the Japanese have a very kind of communitarian, very kind of conformist, emphasis culture. The old saying in Japan is the tall nail gets hammered down. So they don't really, they look askance at conspicuous consumption. They don't think that people owning, huge mansions is actually a status thing, that it's actually showing away. And so for a lot of Japanese, they just don't find that to be, they think it's grotesque that people consume so far beyond, what other people are consuming. Tax brackets are important for understanding. America's income tax system, again, is progressive. And again, that is designed so that it falls more heavily. If you are wealthy, you are expected to pay more in taxes. Again, because of that concept of ability to pay. So you have income brackets from about $40,000 to $50,000, from $50,000 to $60,000, and so on. In 2020, no American paid tax on the first $12,000 of income. And by the time you got to around $20,000, you were taxed at 10%. And if you made $40,000, you were taxed at 12%. In contrast, Social Security taxes are what we might call regressive. Now I want to go back to the tax brackets. So one justification for higher taxation on the wealthy is something known as Engel's Law. And this was promulgated in the 19th century by a German economist and statistician by the name of Ernst Engel. And the basic argument is that income in isolation doesn't really tell us anything about the importance of money. Instead, we need to have a better way for understanding how people in different economic circumstances understand money. So for Engels, how a low-income 21st century janitor understands the utility of a dollar is fundamentally different than how Bill Gates understands a dollar. And so for Engels, the key to measuring this difference in perception is the percentage of household income spent on essential items like rent, clothing, transportation, electricity. And so the greater the proportion of monthly income that's devoted to basically just keeping yourself in operation, the less discretionary income is available. Okay, and so that kind of explains why the government taxing people that make a small amount, a much less money and are living paycheck to paycheck is much more onerous than taxing someone like Bill Gates at a much higher rate. Okay, so when we talk about Social Security taxes being regressive, again, they tend to fall more heavily on lower income groups. For example, with Social Security, the regressivity is created by a cap on income that is subject to the dedicated tax that goes directly to the Social Security Trust Fund. Part of the reason is that Social Security, that Social Security remains a regressive tax are basically the redistributive implications of the program. Social Security was designed to provide more help to lower income Americans than middle class or upper middle class Americans. Again, that janitor that pushes a broom for most of their life and rarely makes more than $20,000 a year will benefit more from Social Security than Bill Gates would, right? Bill Gates likely is never going to apply for Social Security benefits. He doesn't need it. He has more than enough money, okay? And so in 2020, the Federal Insurance Contribution Act's FICA taxes applied only to the first $137,700 of income. And so no one's income is taxed above that rate. And so for Bill Gates, one check in January probably is the only thing that's going to be taxed. And so again, if you illustrate, in 2020, the University of Oklahoma head coach Brent Venables was not taxed on nearly $6.3 million of his income for that year. Okay. Likewise, Mike Gundy, who has been OSU's football coach for 18 years, earns $7.5 million annually, which again means that $7.36 million of Mike Gundy's income is not going to be subject to the Social Security tax. And it tells you something about the values that we place on certain kinds of activities, that the highest paid state employees in just about every state are their football coaches. In some states in the Northeast, it might be the hockey coaches for the state universities. But again, for the most part, it reflects capitalism, right? The reality is that college football is big business. And it's big business because millions of Americans tune in to watch their favorite teams play on Saturdays during football season. And that means that university is providing a service that Americans want to see. It's too bad that more Americans don't value the education that those universities provide, but that is one of the kind of incoherences of a market-based economy. You derange certain outcomes because people place a greater value on them. Spending and budgeting, again, the power to authorize and the power to appropriate money is one of the most important governmental powers granted to the Constitution. An example of what passes for congressional humor is the old saying, authorizers think they're gods, appropriators know they're gods. And that, again, reflects this idea, especially in the House of Representatives, all revenue bills begin in the House. When you're responsible, when you serve, when you are an authorizer or an appropriator, you are wielding enormous influence. Okay, the federal government has the constitutional authority to run annual budgets or annual deficits, which is the amount of money in excess of the government revenues that they've taken in for that year. Okay, and so in contrast to the federal government, most state and local governments have to balance their budgets annually. They can't really run deficits. They can run certain kinds of deficits in the form of bonds. But if RSU, for example, is going to build a new building, they'll have to bond that out, which means they're taking on a certain amount of debt. But it also means that it's paid for before they ever can get it. That's one of the things, RSU, Rogers State University, has wanted to build a new science building for years. Our science building is not good enough for contemporary coursework in science and technology. And so they have been raising money for several years, and they're getting close to about the halfway mark in terms of how much money they need. But that is one of the dominant things that Rogers State University has been trying to do is raise the private means to get that building updated, or frankly leveled and rebuilt. The national debt reflects the sum of all prior annual budgets, and currently it stands at around $30 trillion. The federal government aggressively used deficit spending to fight the Great Recession, and as well back in 2008, 2009. And they also aggressively spent money to fight the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 and 2021. And we can discuss the mechanics of those policy responses. But the reality is that deficits are a lot like any kind of debt, right? They're only as good as what you're using it to purchase, right? As a private household, if you're going into debt in order to buy a car so that you can drive into Tulsa and get a better paying job, that's probably money well spent. But if you're just using it to entertain yourself, then that's probably going to be money that was poorly spent. To a large extent, a lot of the debt that we have had, and let's keep in mind, Donald Trump ran up $8 trillion of debt in the 4 years that he was president. And a lot of that actually even occurred before COVID-19 hit. So the federal government also uses subsidies and contracts to encourage certain kinds of activities. Subsidies are government grants of cash or other valuable commodities such as land to an individual or organization. And again, it's used to promote activities desired by government, to reward political support, or to buy off political opposition. Contracting refers to the power of governments to set conditions on companies that are seeking to sell goods or services to government agencies. Contracting can be deployed to encourage corporations to improve themselves through workplace safety rules, to build up whole sectors of the economy, or to promote certain desirable goals of behavior. An older example of the federal government's use of the contracting power to advance policy goals was the extension of the federal government's contracting authority to the nascent, to the building at the time airline industry to carry mail by air. They basically paid the airlines to carry mail rather than delivering it by trucks. That was, one of the clearest examples of the use of contracting authority. The Biden administration's executive order mandating that all companies holding federal contracts need to be able to document that their employers are vaccinated or submit to weekly testing is an example of that contracting power. I'm sure many of you believe that that was controversial. Several states' attorney generals sued the government to stop the Biden administration. But the testing mandate was clearly well within the federal government's public health responsibilities. And similar actions in the past had been held constitutional. The Office of Management and Budget, which we talked about in several other settings in this over the course of the semester, and the Congressional Budget Office are very important in the budgetary process. So again, the budgetary process controls the nature and scope of all government activities on a year-to-year basis. And the Office of Management and Budget is responsible for preparing the president's budget and also for establishing the president's spending priorities. Congress passed the Budget and Accounting Act in 1921, basically in acknowledgement of the growing influence of the presidency over key aspects of federal spending. And so a key proposal, again, was the creation of the Bureau of the Budget, which then was renamed the Office of Management and Budget in 1924. The law also created the Office of General Accountability, the GAO, which is the key auditing body over the federal government. The OMB's budget proposal is typically the first step in the budgetary process. But the reality is that a president proposes, but Congress ultimately disposes. So, over the course of the Trump administration, Trump's, director of Office of the Office of Management and Budget proposed steep cuts to various social programs that Congress subsequently ignored, especially after 2018 midterms when Democrats took over control of the House of Representatives. At that point, again, the budgetary process became a lot more contentious because Republicans have historically said, we want to cut Social Security and Medicare. We really want to cut Medicaid, which is aid to poor people. But again, at the end of the day, do they have the courage of their convictions? Because when you do that, you are going to cause pain and suffering to the American people. And they remember that stuff, okay? That's one of the few things that will cause Americans to get fired up about you is if you cut something that they think they deserve. The Congressional Budget Office's mission is to provide independent, objective economic analysis of the costs of any kind of legislative action by Congress. So Congress's intent in creating the CBO was to consolidate Congress's role in the budgetary process and to ensure that Congress has access to accurate and reliable information about the costs and the economic impacts of specific legislative proposals in light of the overall budget. So that is really the job of the CBO, is to say, okay, guys, you want to cut taxes? Here's what it's going to cost. Okay? Now, monetary policy refers to government efforts to regulate the economy through the manipulation of the supply of money and credit. The Federal Reserve Board, which I've talked about before, otherwise known as the Fed, is responsible for playing that role of central banking institution for the United States. Now, if you ever take a class in macroeconomics, central banking institutions are independent or semi-independent banking institutions that basically enjoy a monopoly over the various central functions within the economy, including the management of monetary policy. And they ensure a balance between maintaining price stability but also maintaining high rates of employment. And oftentimes those two things are happening at odds with one another. A lot of people thought that because the Biden administration, so many jobs were being created, that was actually an indicator of inflation, and that unemployment had to rise in order for the economy to stabilize and to stave off inflation. So the independence of these central banking institutions are critical for a healthy economy, because in theory it precludes the president from seeking to manipulate the value of currency to secure a short-term advantage to the president and the president's party in the electoral process. The last time we saw that kind of manipulation was Nixon in the early 1970s. And the result was stagflation. Stagflation is like a paradoxical moment in time that was largely caused by the OPEC oil embargoes. But it's a situation where prices continued rising despite the fact that the economy was inflating, it was shrinking. Okay, so the history of banking in American capitalism has oftentimes been punctuated by intense controversy. We actually had a national banking system in the early years of the Republic that was ultimately abolished by the Jackson administration in the early 19th century. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton advocated for the creation of the Bank of the United States, and its activities in the opening decades of the new Republic, carried out the Federalist and Anti-Federalist, conflicts, over the role of money. Again, a lot of the Anti-Federalists, those folks ended up becoming part of the Jeffersonian Democratic Party in the early years of the 19th century, and they were deeply hostile to this idea of a national banking system. So again, the Fed is comprised of 12 regional reserve banks. It was formed in 1913, again the same year that the 16th Amendment was ratified. At the top, it sits at the top of the financial system. And again, it's comprised of 7 members appointed by the president, subject to Senate confirmation, and they serve 14-year-long terms. Okay, and again, the chairman of the Fed is actually, the part of the way you ensure independence is to basically make the terms for chairman of the Fed like 7 years, which means that the Fed chairman is never up in a presidential election cycle, and that again, the point is you want the Fed to be independent. Okay, the 7 regional reserve banks are independent of the political branches, and neither the president nor Congress can directly intervene in the Fed's policies. Again, for much of the 20th century, presidents were reluctant to openly criticize the Federal Reserve Board's policies. But in recent years, you've seen, criticisms from both the left and the right. With the left basically saying that the Fed has been way too tight, and the right basically, in many instances, the right, some people on the right have called for the elimination of the Federal Reserve. And so that has created challenges, for the Fed in preserving its effectiveness and legitimacy. So there are advantages that commercial banks enjoy when they are part of the Federal Reserve System. Banks who join the Federal Reserve System can borrow from their regional Federal Reserve banks. That is important because what is the point of a bank? Some of you may not be aware of it, but the point of banks is to make money. They make money by managing people's money, by storing it, but also by investing money in ways that bring revenue into the bank. So again, the principal advantage is that banks can expand their loan operations continuously so long as there's sufficient demand. That advantage comes with rather significant strings attached. The Fed can impose strict reserve requirements on banks seeking loans within the system. And the Fed can raise or lower the discount rate reserve banks extend to investment in commercial banks. So open and closing what we call the discount window gives the Fed powerful indirect control over the money supply. I talked about the idea of the Fed being able to open or close the spigot of the economy, of the money supply, depending on conditions within the economy. So the Fed can give, the Fed can take away. You also have important regulation and antitrust policies in place. Two ways that the federal economic regulatory policy is designed to protect consumers from potential abuses that can be caused by concentrated economic power. First, the federal government establishes rules for the operation of big businesses to ensure fair competition. For example, federal regulators can require that information about corporations' activities and account books are publicly available. Secondly, federal regulators have access to antitrust laws that can determine whether a corporation is engaging in what is known as restraint on trade, by driving competitions out of business. Among the penalties available to federal regulators for corporate bad actors included breaking up large companies into smaller units. A lot of people have argued. The Federal Trade Commission, the leader of that group, Lina Khan, has basically argued for breaking up Amazon. That Amazon is in fact an effective monopoly. That right now people benefit from it. But it is wielding enormous economic power within the economy. Okay, so federal regulators can also engage in social regulation, which establishes conditions on businesses to protect workers, the environment, and consumers. So what are the origins of regulatory policy? Again, calls for protective regulation began in the 19th century due to the Industrial Revolution. So when you think about it, what was the origin point of regulation? It was the monopoly on movement of goods that the railroads began establishing really in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. That really was a huge driver of industrialization. And industrialization produces, again, concentrations of wealth at the top of the economy. You saw the emergence of enormously wealthy people who used their money in ways to manipulate the politics of that day. And we're seeing very similar, a very similar situation today with Elon Musk, who purchased Twitter, changed it to X, and effectively turned it into a political organ dominating a lot of social, communication. A lot of people get most of their news from Twitter. And so again, you're seeing, the realities that people are becoming enormously, powerful and wealthy. Elon Musk, derives a great deal of his wealth from government contracts, and Donald Trump has just named him to basically, what do you call it, the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. He's putting a guy with billions of dollars in government contracts at the head of a project to cut federal spending. Does anyone think he's going to cut his contracts? I don't think so. Okay, so again, this is a huge problem with the idea of conflicts of interest, and what do we do to try and kind of ameliorate those risks? So the first regulatory commission was the Interstate Commerce Commission that was created through the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, and it was again designed to protect consumers and farmers from the monopolistic practices of the railroads. Likewise, in 1890, you had the Sherman Antitrust Act, and then in 1914, you had the Clayton Antitrust Act that basically, again, what is the point? It is supposed to prevent restraint on trade, right? Where people are using their size to drive competitors out of business. One of the reasons for a lot of the government reforms that led to regulatory policy was the role that journalism played in exposing abuses, okay? Muckraking journalists like Upton Sinclair. Again, the Interstate Commerce Commission was abolished in 1995, but its functions continued under the Federal Trade Commission, which I mentioned just a minute ago. So muckraking journalists like Upton Sinclair led to the creation of, for example, the Federal Meat Inspection Act. Sinclair wrote a famous book called The Jungle. Some viewers may have had that book assigned to them when they were in high school or college. And it basically focused on the horrors of the meatpacking industry in Chicago in the early 20th century. What you saw as we moved into the 20th century was an enormous movement of people into cities. And with that urbanization, people really didn't have access to fresh meat. When they lived on a farm, they could slaughter a hog, slaughter a cow, and live on that for a long time if they were able to preserve the meat. What was happening now was that people living in cities had to rely on basically canned meat, to get protein. And so the meatpacking industry was grotesque because they had child labor. They had unsafe and unsanitary, work environments. They didn't understand the role of needing to periodically clean the machines, and so it was a terrible situation. And so the Meat Inspection Act was designed to bring federal regulators into those factories and to compel them to clean up their act. And we still see these problems today. Like, for example, with the Boar's Head recent food poisoning episodes. So the Food and Drug Administration was created in the 1930s, and again, it was authorized to test and regulate various products, and it also has a snake oil component to it. The point to the Food and Drug Administration is to go to advertisers and say, are you really, is the product that you're selling really doing what you claim it's doing? One of the big ads you see all over the place these days are ads for Prevagen, right, which is supposed to be a memory improvement, herbal supplement. And you'll note that especially with the recent round of commercials for Prevagen, what are they saying? They're not saying this thing improved my memory. I found, is what they're saying, that over time, I seemed to think that my memory was getting sharper. So they softened what they were promising that the drug, that this product was doing in order to avoid being sued by the Food and Drug Administration. So the modern era of national regulation began in the 1930s as part of the New Deal. Regulatory policy was extended to the agricultural sector. Various kinds of agricultural subsidies were put in place during this period. Major sectors of the economy, like the securities, was created. You created the Securities and Exchange Commission. Radio, with the Radio Act, created regulation of broadband. Banking was subject. Again, now you have the FDIC, which is designed to protect people's deposits. And again, the FDIC they're the ones that come in. If a bank gets closed, if a bank goes bankrupt, the FDIC comes in, they clear out the books, they fire everybody, and they get it set up to where it can be rebooted. But the main thing they do is protect people's deposits, up to $100,000 per account. And that's, again, an important thing to keep in mind. I can't remember if it's 100,000 these days or 150,000. So again, the point of the Securities and Exchange Commission was, again, because the stock market used to be subject to manipulation, and still is periodically. So the SEC requires companies buying and selling stocks and bonds to disclose information about the products they're trading and to inform buyers of the investment risks. And basically, they're there to protect investors against fraud. And so how do they do that? Well, the Securities and Exchange Commission is comprised of economists who specialize in identifying market manipulation. Okay, and how can you tell when a market is being manipulated? When you see someone buying enormous sums of one particular stock or dumping stock at a particular time, that could be evidence that they are engaging in stock manipulation. That was something that got Martha Stewart in trouble, for example. Many, many years ago, Martha Stewart actually was convicted of a felony. She actually had a situation where she dumped several $100,000 worth of pharmaceutical stock. And it was suspiciously timed because shortly after she dumped the stock, that stock announced, that pharmaceutical company announced that a drug that they were counting on going to market had been delayed by the Food and Drug Administration. And it turned out that Martha Stewart was close friends with the CEO of that company. He told her she dumped the stock. That is illegal under the law. Now, the problem is, that's not what got her in trouble. What got her in trouble was when federal regulators came to her and said, this is a suspiciously timed stock option. And again, remember, Martha Stewart had been a stock trader, a stockbroker in her earlier careers. She lied to those federal regulators and said, I had instructed my broker to dump the stock at a certain point in time, and it was just an accident of timing. Well, that turned out to be a lie. Lying to federal regulators is the crime that lands you in jail, okay? If she had admitted that she had dumped the stock and had insider information and simply, recouped, basically paid out the few $100,000 that, and again, remember, she was closing in on being a billionaire at that point in time. It was a minuscule amount of money that enabled, that she was saving and dumping that stock. So if she had just repaid that money in a fine or something like that, she wouldn't have gotten in any trouble. Instead, she lied to federal regulators, and then she persisted through a trial, and that's what got her in trouble. Okay, so again, during the 1930s and 40s, Congress established the basic framework for labor regulation as well, and again, that included rules for collective bargaining. And also during the 1930s, you had the minimum wage established, which again is a point of real contention between liberals and conservatives. In the 1970s, agencies like the Consumer Protection Agency and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration were created and granted additional authority and expanded scope to protect both consumers and workers in the workplace. Since the 1970s, there has been a trend towards deregulation, and that is a largely conservative policy preference of reducing or eliminating regulatory restraints on the conduct of individuals and private institutions in the economy. Both the Reagan, Bush, and Trump administrations were notable for reducing the total number of regulations in the Federal Register, with Trump imposing an executive order in 2017 that required 2 significant regulations to be eliminated for every 1 regulation created. So there's a critical question. How much government regulation is really needed? Liberals would argue more regulation, conservatives would argue less. When you get more regulation, it can impede economic growth, and that can have an effect on people's access to good-paying jobs. At the same time, however, less regulation results in people getting hurt, with people being overworked, with people, with labor being abused, with consumers being manipulated and defrauded. These are the consequences that happen in both situations. And so you really want to try to find that sweet spot where you have sufficient regulation to impede consumer abuses and worker protection, where workers are protected, while at the same time, allowing businesses to operate profitably. That is sort of the sweet spot you have to try and reach. So many of the most contentious partisan issues revolve essentially around regulatory policy. So economic policy is inherently political, and again, there are lots and lots of political incentives for government intervention in the economy. There is a long history of American voters punishing presidents and parties when the economy is struggling. And I would argue in 2024, I made this point, variously publicly actually, that if more people walked into the polling booths that were concerned about inflation, and concerned about the border, then Donald Trump was going to win. And if more people were concerned about other issues, about abortion or issues like threats to democracy, then the Democrat was going to win. It turned out more people cared about inflation, right? And about how they felt about the economy. And I would argue, too, that Trump lost in 2020 because he didn't handle COVID-19 right. And people, his approval ratings were at 34% in 2020, in November of 2020. That's tough. That's tough to overcome. So until 1929, most Americans strongly adhered to the assumptions that guided laissez-faire capitalism. Okay, and laissez-faire is a French phrase for leave it alone, and it reflected the view that private ownership of the commanding heights of industry, and that was the best way to do things. That markets should govern how the economy operates. Okay, and that private profit benefits everybody. The whole idea was that with mercantilism and the domestic economy going as fast as it can, that everyone would have jobs and everyone would be happy. That everyone would have enough money to get through their lives. Okay. The Great Depression changed all that, as we talked about in our discussions of federalism and other discussions, that destroyed that consensus and led to thoroughgoing changes in the relationship between the economy and the state. So again, in 1932, you had a challenger, Democratic governor of New York, Franklin Roosevelt, promising a New Deal for the forgotten man. And so for much of the remainder of the 20th century, basically a liberal, and by that I mean a welfare liberal, Keynesian view of the economy prevailed. And Keynesianism kind of refers to followers of the British economist John Maynard Keynes. And he basically argued that government can act as a spender of last resort, can intervene in the economy to prevent depressions, to prevent these situations where the economy goes into a prolonged period of contraction, like the Great Depression. And in fact, a lot of the things that were created over the course of the New Deal acted as economic stabilizers. We haven't really had an economy as bad as the Great Depression since the 1930s because of many of these programs like Social Security and Medicare that are designed, when the economy goes into recession, elderly people still get their Social Security checks, and so they're still spending money. That keeps the economy from contracting any further than it would otherwise. Okay? So you have fundamental partisanship, partisan divisions over the role of government in the economy. So in the late 1970s, you had a backlash against the Democratic commitment to tax and spend policies that had begun in the 1930s under the New Deal era and persisted well into the 1960s. So that fueled the rise of an alternative Republican view, which is known as supply-side economics. And again, the idea there is that if you cut taxes on high-income earners, they will plow that money back into the economy. It will produce more jobs. It will produce more economic activity. Winners of economic debates are able to successfully persuade the American public that their policies create that rising tide that lifts all boats. That that if the economy is going good, and if our policies improve the economy, then everyone will benefit. Okay, so Ronald Reagan personified the Republican rejection of Keynesian economics with a statement in his first inaugural address. Government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. He basically campaigned arguing that we needed to reduce the size and scope of the federal government. That is an argument that persists to this very day. From 1980 to 2024, the persistent Republican argument has been we must reduce the size and scope of the federal government, shift more of the governing burden onto the states, and that will produce a much more healthy economy, and that will benefit everyone. Republicans have moved steadily in a more laissez-faire direction over the past 40 years. And again, the one thing that they generally agree on is taxes. They want to cut taxes because they think that will lead to a kind of natural shrinkage of the size and scope of the federal government. They want less government spending. They want less economic regulation. So these debates have intensified over the course of the 2020s as, again, the coronavirus pandemic led to the passage of the CARES Act. The CARES Act was passed in March of 2020, and it was largely bipartisan. It included $1,200 payments to all American taxpayers, forgivable loans to small business owners, $500 billion in loans to large corporations, and controversially, $338.9 billion in loans to state and local governments. Now, I will tell you, if you were a student at Rogers State University, you benefited from that $338 billion. We actually got a big chunk of money. We were able to continue our operations because of that spending. Okay? So these actions were undertaken as the pandemic led to a substantial shutdown of the economy. That resulted in widespread unemployment in many economic sectors, including the restaurant, the travel, and the hotel industries. If you were working on one of those cruise ships down in Florida or or over in California, you were out of work for that period of time because no one was getting on a cruise ship in that period. So following the 2020 presidential elections, again, Republicans opposed any further attempt to expand governmental response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But Democrats, nevertheless, were able to get a lot done through reconciliation, which is a budgetary expedient that basically gives them the ability to pass certain legislation without a filibuster. So again, on taxes and spendings, Republicans embrace the idea of reducing the role of government, and that's led to calls, that typically leads to calls for tax cuts. Since the Reagan administration, Republicans have embraced supply-side economics. Likewise, on spending, the two parties have struggled over government spending. Most Americans are easily persuaded by the theory that big government spending is wasteful. In point of fact, when this Department of Government Efficiency starts up, they're going to find that there's not that much inefficiency. There's not that much waste, fraud, and abuse. Republicans always claim that there's billions and billions of dollars in waste, fraud, and abuse. There isn't. Even in a $6.2 trillion budget, there is not that much to cut out. And when they start cutting, they're going to find they're going to cut things that people like and want. Polls reveal very little support for specific cuts to programs. Neither party is prepared to sacrifice the political capital necessary to cut major programs like Social Security and Medicare. When you add the three things up, Social Security, Medicare, and military spending, that's almost 60% of the federal budget annually. So if you're going to cut any of those things, if you really want to reduce the size and scope of the federal government, you have to attack those things. And that is difficult for people to do. So generally, Democrats would prefer to enhance investment in social welfare and economic regulatory programs. They want to invest in human capital. Republicans say we want to put money in your pocket. Those are really how they frame those kinds of debates. Economic regulation, again, the mission of federal regulation of business is to promote economic stability, to maintain workplace safety, to set minimum wages. Again, if you're working full-time at Walmart, but you still need food assistance, then are you being paid a living wage? That is really the question, right? The fact that the minimum wage is as low as it is in many states basically increases people's dependence on government to meet their basic needs. So businesses and corporations often use their economic influence to limit the government's role, while consumer interest groups press for stronger government regulations. This is, we have kind of an interest group society where multiple groups of people are fighting over, how government is going to respond to certain kinds of issues. Both parties can point to public opinion surveys saying that there is strong support for their position. The issue of the minimum wage is one that, again, sharply divides the political parties. Some Democrats have advocated pegging the minimum wage to inflation, while many Republicans are opposed to a federal minimum wage at all. As of November 2020, 30 states and nearly 4 cities and counties had enacted minimum wage laws higher than the current minimum federal wage, which is $7.25 an hour. That is not a living wage, folks. I just have to tell you that. In fact, there are arguments that we should be steadily raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour just to meet the current cost of living. The welfare state was created to address insecurity. Okay, welfarism came late to the United States. Many European nations adopted welfare policies in the middle of the 19th century. In England, for example, conservatives, the Tories, appealed to the newly enfranchised working class voters with worker protection. This is known as Tory democracy. And British conservatives, if you look at it, British conservatives are often the party of the working class because conservatives were willing to appeal to the British working class to peel voters away from the Whig Party, okay, and later from Labour. That changed the nature of electoral coalitions in British politics. To this day, sectors of the British working class remain closely aligned with the Tories. Likewise in Germany, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, shortly after German unification, the establishment of the German state, offered German workers generous welfare programs. Why? Because German social labor unions were basically socialist in nature. Many of them were Marxists who advocated the overthrow of the state, the overthrow of capitalism, as a whole. And so Bismarck basically saw welfarism as a way of demonstrating to German workers that they had a stake in the system and that they could benefit from it. American welfare policies draw heavily on the British model. It's much more of an ad hoc kind of system. American welfarism is distinctly American. It is highly program-driven and governed by the distinctive rules of each individual program. So again, contributory systems like Social Security and Medicare are funded by dedicated payroll taxes, which I discussed a little while ago. Those taxes are paid directly to the Social Security system. Those programs are often described as entitlement programs because paying into them, at some point you get vested in this system. Now, I don't think, I don't think of them as entitlement programs. I think of them as programs that I paid into over the course of my life, and I expect to see them there when I retire in a few years. The modern welfare state is comprised of three separate categories of programs. Contributory systems are, again, systems like Social Security where, again, you pay into it. A non-contributory system is like Medicaid or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, and Pell Grants. These don't require contributions from beneficiaries. However, you do have to establish that you are eligible for those programs. That's why they're called often means-based programs. You have to basically demonstrate that you need them in order to become eligible for them. You also, again, have the tax expenditure system. So again, for much of American history, the care for the poor was handled at the local level. Again, for much of the colonial period, well into the 19th century, churches and local governments managed the care of the poor. So to illustrate, the predominant occupation of many East Coast towns in the 18th and 19th century was fishing, which was always a hazardous occupation. And in a bad winter storm season, you might have a significant percentage of the town's breadwinners, killed by a sinking of a ship, and that's again through no fault of their own. When such circumstances occurred, local churches would find themselves overwhelmed with trying to keep families and orphans fed, clothed, and housed. And so oftentimes you had local governments that would establish widows and orphans programs. Social welfare spending also spiked at the state level following the Civil War, where you had 600,000 Americans killed, and actually it was more than that now. They estimate it was closer to 700,000. But additionally, hundreds of thousands of soldiers lost their limbs. If you got shot in the arm, they were taking your arm off because they couldn't preserve it more often than not, given the state of medicine at that time. And so, states actually invested in prosthetic limbs. Okay, the Great Depression caused this partially privatized, decentralized system to collapse, and the Roosevelt administration drew on ideas from Europe to create the American welfare state. And again, many of the original contributory and non-contributory programs originated with the Social Security Act, which is the foundation of the American welfare state. So contributory programs are financed in advance by dedicated taxes. They're described again as social insurance, and that amounted again to programs where you contribute a percentage of your income on a day-to-day, on a week-to-week or month-to-month basis to that program. Social Security is the largest of those programs. And again, they're pooled across workers, and they have significantly redistributive implications, which again means that lower income people are going to benefit more from them. Okay. Then finally, you have the idea of COLA adjustments. That means that Social Security recipients get inflation protection. Economists calculate the COLA adjustment, and that increases their payment. Okay. The largest single expansion of the program was contributory program was Medicare in 1965. So I'm going to close on that note. When we come back, we will continue with our discussion of domestic policy. I'll see you next time.